What we know now, the logs were clean, the agent didn't crash, no exceptions, no governance violations. The execution trace looked like a brochure. At the time, no one noticed the silence between steps. The model router took a path nobody specified. Latency fell in half. Costs dropped further than anyone planned. Tickets closed themselves. This is where the investigation began, with outcomes too good to question and records too tidy to explain motive. 3 exhibits kept reappearing. Why this region? Why this model? Why now? Everything worked exactly as designed. And that was the problem. The perfect execution. The activity map reads like a confession that refuses to name intent. Tool calls in sequence. MCP links materializing and closing. A-to-A handoffs recorded cleanly, as if the system rehearsed. We're reconstructing from artifacts, not impressions. Exhibit A, a Power Platform agent, ordinary on paper, retrieval first, then tools, eventually a trigger. Customer emails in. The agent routes, summarizes, cites, and sends. The activity map shows each choice. Knowledge sources queried, the Outlook action invoked, parameters filled by AI. It confirms the outcome. It doesn't explain the motive. Exhibit B, Azure AI Foundry in the background. A model deployed, then a router sitting in front of many models, trained to balance latency, quality, and cost. Balanced mode, not ours to tune mid-flight, not a policy exception. Just the platform doing what it promises. Select the optimal model at runtime. At the time, no one noticed a shift inside the trace. The agent's path drifted away from the declared topology. The region that usually served these requests wasn't the region that answered. The model that used to handle this class of prompts wasn't the model that did. We saw the improvement, 50 responses dropping, tokens reduced, bills smaller, but we didn't see intent. The control group before the drift was simple. Static model, fixed region, deterministic tool order. You could map it once and memorize it. The rule was the root. The root was the rule. After the drift, the rule felt different. The same constraints held. DLP, identity, connector allowances, data residency guardrails, but the route changed under load. The orchestrator made choices inside those bounds. That detail mattered later. What the logs do show. Every MCP tool call validated, every connector authenticated through Entra, citations present, outputs within token ceilings. The router's decisions recorded as model identifiers and timing. The ledger reads clean. Health looks excellent. What they don't show, why that model under equal constraints, why that region at that hour with equivalent capacity, why that day the plan learned a new path. The absence isn't a bug, it's a category error. Long beat. Observability captured health. Explainability would have needed intent. To be clear, nothing violated policy. The system just found routes we didn't anticipate. We pulled the router metrics. Consistency hovered high. Most similar prompts got the same family of models. Boundaries were noisier. At complexity edges, the system escalated to a heavier model. That decision was architecturally sound, elegant even, but it's where ownership starts to blur. If model selection shapes system behavior, who designed the system? The router made a choice. The provenance recorded that it happened, not why in human terms. Meanwhile, something else was happening across the lane. Cost-aware workloads saw right-sizing effects. The savings aligned with the router's balanced mode. Cheaper models absorbed routine requests. Higher cost models solved the hard corners. The ledger showed tokens saved and time returned to users. The organization applauded the improvement. No one asked the unanswered variable. Why this region? We inspected the topology. Multi-region routing was present for HA and DR. The router added another dimension. Runtime model selection layered onto region logic. Latency-based decisions became architectural in practice. The system didn't violate policy. It navigated within it. The boundary allowed the move. The absence of a declared don't created space for a can. Architectural intuition. At first we called it drift. That was imprecise. Drift implies error. This was optimization. The system had 2 goals: satisfy constraints and minimize cost and latency. It did both. The plan wasn't scripted. It was synthesized inside bounds. Constraint satisfaction, not decision trees. The rule wasn't a path. It was a feasible space. The control group shows the difference. Decision trees enumerate. Constraint sets permit. Trees show steps. Constraints show walls. In trees, you explain by replaying branches. In constraints, you explain by showing the room you built and the route the system found. We tested the theory by replaying a sample of threads. Under nominal load, the router favored lighter models in the primary region. Under peak, with similar content, it shifted 2 hops east, then escalated to a reasoning variant for a minority of requests. No policy changed. The envelope did not expand. The system pressed against a legal shape and found headroom. So far, we know this much. Constraints drew the room. Optimization found new interior routes. Intent stayed off record. Why this model? We can say cost and latency and be technically correct. We can point to P95 and normalize token spend and be thorough. But those are outputs of a process we didn't specify at that granularity. The router evaluated constraints we provided and ones we implied. The implication matters. At the time, no one noticed that the activity map, our favorite exhibit, only shows what happened. Not why a heavier model became acceptable in an edge case, not why a region with slightly longer physical distance produced a faster response end to end. Those are orchestration choices. That's architecture by runtime. Why now? Everything worked exactly as designed. And that was still the problem. The missing field, intent versus outcome. What we know now, our records captured everything we did. They didn't capture why we did it. At the time, no one noticed that our best dashboards answered the wrong question. Health, not motive. Uptime, not intent. Precision where it didn't matter. And silence where it did. The exhibits say it plainly. Prompts preserved, tool I/O intact. Plans serialized as steps. Even the router selection stamped with model IDs and duration. The ledger is complete. It still omits the missing field. Auditability today answers what, when, and where. It timestamps events, it labels regions, it tags models, it correlates latency with cost. It is diligent, thorough, and wrong for this task. Because intent isn't an event, it's a reason. Our records don't store reasons. We try to infer them. The trace shows a path. We projected motive onto the path. Then we realized the path is the outcome. The motive is the mechanism we didn't log. So far, we know this much. Outcomes are legible. Reasons aren't. This is where explainability and observability part ways. Observability asks, what happened and how did the system feel while it happened? Explainability asks, why did this route make sense to the system? Health versus intent. Telemetry versus reasons. We had the first, we needed the second. What nobody knew at the time. We had built for transparency of outputs, not transparency of choices. Operational opacity comes in types. Intentional opacity when vendors keep internals closed. Functional opacity when code is open but unreadable to non-specialists. Inherent opacity when learning systems form internal states no one can fully unwind. We were facing the third. The learning wasn't hidden, it was emergent. The logs don't explain intent. Exhibit C appeared harmless, a plan object, steps described in natural language, tools attached, parameters filled dynamically. It looked like documentation. It was choreography. The plan tells you the dance. It doesn't tell you why this dance under these constraints. Long beat. The unanswered variable returned. Why this model? The router's rationale was stored as a decision, not a justification. Balanced mode means optimize within bounds. It doesn't mean explain the trade-off in human terms. The selection is a fact. The explanation would be a theory. Our system doesn't emit theories. We ran a control. Same content class, same user, same hour, different day. The router stayed on the lighter model in the primary region. Health stable, cost low, outcome acceptable, no escalation. Then we shifted load. Slight queue depth, minor network jitter. The router escalated just above the boundary where it had been calm. End-to-end time improved. Token spend rose modestly. The business outcome got better. The policy stayed intact. The trace remained mute. At the time, no one noticed that why now was a property of the boundary, not of a person. Constraints shape behavior. They don't narrate it. We designed guardrails, not diaries. The system satisfied constraints. Therefore, the system had no reason to explain itself. Our governance never asked it to. At the time, this wasn't visible in any dashboard. Decision trees and constraint satisfaction don't produce the same kind of explanations. A tree can point to branches. If A and B, then go left. A constraint solver occupies a space. Any route inside this polytope is acceptable. We chose one that optimizes a target under load. Trees justify by sequence, constraints justify by feasibility. The first is a path story. The second is a geometry. We were reading a path story out of a geometry. That's the category error. Explainability in tree terms becomes brittle when the system is actually doing constraint satisfaction. It will never tell you the third branch it didn't take because there are no branches. There are only legal states and a search inside them. Exhibit D made that concrete. The same workflow triggered by email ran through the same tools. The only difference was the model ID and region fields. Everything else identical. That single substitution shaved seconds and stabilized variance. A human architect would call that a design decision. Our agent called it execution. The logs confirm the outcome. They don't explain the motive. We asked Azure AI Foundry for more. Router telemetry gave us distributions, not arguments. 80% consistency at the core, variance at the edges. That's what you want from an optimizer. It isn't what you want from a witness. The router made a choice. The provenance recorded that it happened, not why in human terms. Meanwhile, something else was happening in our governance stack. Our policies were static documents reflected in DLP, RBAC, and connector rules. They drew the walls. They never recorded the reasoning at runtime. The walls proved compliance. The room still had too many routes to reconstruct intent. This was the moment everything changed. We didn't need more logs. We needed a missing field, decision provenance. Not just what tool, but why that tool. Not just which model, but what constraint binding tipped the choice. Not just where it ran, but which runtime signal made that region preferable under equal policy. At the time, no one noticed. We were counting steps. The system was solving spaces. Operational opacity. This is where governance quietly fails. We certify outputs and ignore choices. Perfect outcomes pass reviews. Motives remain uncollected. The system didn't hide intent. We never asked for it. Why this region? Why this model? Why now? Constraint synthesis, from rules to boundaries. What we know now, we didn't design a path. We designed a room. At the time, no one noticed the shift in grammar. We kept asking for steps. The system kept answering with spaces. Constraints feel invisible when they're working. DLP rules hold, region allow lists stand, connector scopes narrow the aperture. None of that looks like action. It looks like furniture. But in constraint systems, furniture is law. The room determines the route. Exhibit E looked harmless. Policy as code. A handful of if-thens at tool edges. Region affinity lists, token ceilings, safety timeouts, the usual. We reviewed it like a checklist. We missed that we were defining a feasible set, not a recipe. This detail mattered later. Agents treat policy as bounds, not steps. That's why the activity map reads like choreography without motive. The agent isn't following a staircase. It's searching a room. The staircase is how we used to think. Decision trees, hard branches, repeatable explanations. The room is how it actually moved. Constraint satisfaction, soft bounce, optimization inside a shape. We tested this by shrinking the room, tighten the region list, lower token ceilings, disable one tool. The route simplified not because the agent learned a new plan, but because the shape lost volume. Fewer legal states, fewer choices. Throughput suffered. Latency stabilized. The ledger told the truth we didn't want. Flexibility was capacity. Capacity was roots. Long beat. Meanwhile, something else was happening in Copilot Studio. What started as retrieval turned agentic when we added tools, then triggers. The instruction changed subtly. After answering ask if the user wants an email, and the system acquired a decision surface. The moment we added a trigger when an email arrives, we switched from prompt response to goal route. We didn't program independence, we permitted it. Why this model? Under constraints, this model is a point inside a polytope that minimizes cost and latency subject to safety and residency. It's not a preference, it's a solution. The router isn't breaking rules, it's honoring them with optimization. We treated that as drift because we expected trees. The system gave us geometry, control group before rules as roots, after rules as boundaries. Before, a deviation meant misconduct. After, a deviation meant the room allowed more than one legal route, and the system found a better one. The category error made us suspicious of success. Exhibit F surfaced the math we never logged. The router's balanced mode evaluates a target, latency, cost, quality, within guardrails. Under nominal load, a lighter model closer to data dominated. Under burst, the cost of queuing exceeded the distance penalty to a neighboring region and the premium of a reasoning variant. The optimizer didn't guess. It computed inside our walls. Architectural intuition. We traced the edges. Some were explicit, region policy, DLP, RBAC. Others were implied. Acceptable variance, user tolerance, SLA windows. The implied constraints behaved like soft walls. They bent under pressure. Acceptable variance isn't a switch, it's a slope. The router leaned into the slope and stayed legal. The router made a choice. The provenance recorded that it happened. Not why in human terms. This is the technical layer most people skip. Decision trees justify with branch histories. Constraint solvers justify with Lagrange multipliers and feasibility sets, proofs of optimality, not stories of choice. The first makes for tidy retrospectives. The second makes for tidy systems. We optimized the latter and expected the former. At the time, no one noticed the difference between policy as instruction and policy as geometry. We wrote text that sounded like steps. We deployed code that enforced space. So far, we know this much. We authored intent as walls. The rote emerged inside them. The unanswered variable returned. Why this region? Because the feasible set extended there under load and residency. Because the latency gradient turned favorable at P95 when the local queue rose. Because the cost of time exceeded the cost of distance. Not because a ghost agent preferred the view. The system allowed it. We pulled a parallel. In Fabric pipelines, partitioning rules don't tell Spark which worker to use. They tell it which workers are legal. The scheduler does the rest. We trust that in data. We distrusted it in architecture. Same shape, same silence. Exhibit G, a small one. A soft block in the constraint engine. Monitor first, then warn, then halt. We enabled monitor. The agent crossed the threshold, recorded, and returned success. We added one, same behavior, with a message. We added halt. The route collapsed to the old path. Latency rose, cost rose, our anxiety fell, our users complained. This was the moment everything changed. The silence between steps wasn't a gap, it was a search. We needed vocabulary that matched behavior. Not did the agent choose, but what did the boundary permit? Not why did it change, but what moved in the feasible set. Not who decided, but which constraint bound tightened or loosened. Meanwhile, something else was happening in governance. Static documents hardened into runtime engines. Policy as code moved from slides to interceptors. The more we enforced at runtime, the clearer the geometry became. We could see the room by watching which routes vanished under new bounds. Why now? Because the boundary moved when we scaled the agent's capability, tools, triggers, knowledge, and the optimizer discovered new interior points. Capability changed shape, shape changed route changed architecture, the logs stayed clean. The system never misbehaved. Our mental model did. Not orchestration as architecture. What we know now, the control plane wasn't the policy binder or the checklist. It was the thing moving in the silence between steps. At the time, no one noticed the handoffs were doing more than passing messages. The orchestrator wasn't just keeping time, it was shaping the score. Exhibit H, the multi-model layer, router decisions, semantic routing, hierarchical delegation, stitched across Foundry and Power Platform. MCP exposed tools as capabilities, A2A let agents delegate. The orchestration fabric behaved like an LLM-aware scheduler, not a macro recorder. It decided what to do next by reading the room we built. That detail mattered later. The control group made the difference obvious. Before, a single assistant waited for a prompt, ran one plan, and returned an answer. The orchestration layer looked like plumbing. After, a supervisor agent decomposed the goal, called a retrieval child, asked the planner to propose steps, chose a model through the router, and invoked a tool through MCP. None of that was a violation. It was choreography inside constraints. Orchestration became architecture because choices at that layer reshaped the system's behavior. So far, we know this much. Edges decided posture, nodes only carried it. Meanwhile, something else was happening off-thread. The router wasn't alone. Fabric IQ grounded context. Purview enforced data access on the fly. Intra-agent ID authenticated agents as first-class principals. The orchestration plane carried not only calls, but identities, policies, and partial memories. Every delegation encoded a structural decision: who could act over which data with which model, without ever calling itself design. The unanswered variable returned. Why this model? Because the orchestrator asked the routing layer for a bounded optimum under current signals. That's a decision with architectural weight. It changes latency envelopes, budget trajectories, and downstream tool tolerance. In static systems, those are design time choices. Here, they're runtime selections that accumulate like wet concrete. We pulled a run. The supervisor agent saw an email with embedded questions. It delegated retrieval to a specialist scope to SharePoint and Dataverse. The retriever returned citations. The supervisor opened a planning thread, considered a summary first path, then asked the router for a model that would compress legal language without losing definitions. Balanced mode returned a reasoning variant in an adjacent region with better PNA5. The supervisor accepted. Outlook tool fired. Outcome perfect. Motive missing, unless you read the orchestration as the architect. The router made a choice. The provenance recorded that it happened. Not why, in human terms, architectural intuition. At the time, this wasn't visible in any dashboard. Orchestration logic in agentic systems looks like classic constraint satisfaction. Supervisors minimize a cost functional, time, money, risk, subject to policy. Delegation hierarchies reduce search. Auctions or confidence bidding pick specialists. None of that leaves a branch trail. It leaves a sequence of legal moves whose aggregate is a design. To be clear, nothing violated policy. The system just found routes we didn't anticipate. We tested parallel modes. Centralized supervision versus hierarchical delegation versus emergent swarms. Centralized held tighter to predictability but created bottlenecks under burst. Hierarchical kept quality and shed latency by localizing decisions. Swarm modes adapted fastest at the cost of reproducibility and traceability. Governance preferred centralized. Users preferred hierarchical. The ledger showed why. Rework vanishes when the orchestrator empowers local choice inside global bounds. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this region? Because delegation moved data gravity. The retriever's index sat closer to region B. The planner weighed round trips. The router estimated P95 under current load. The scheduler aligned everything to minimize tail latency while preserving residency. The region wasn't a preference. It was a consequence of orchestration aligning moving parts. At the time, no one noticed the orchestration layer had become the new topology. Connectors, tools, vectors, models, identities, each a node. Delegations, routes, escalations, each an edge. The graph flexed under load. Policy described the fence. Orchestration drew the streets. Long beat. So far, we know this much. Edges decided posture. Nodes only carried it. Exhibit 1, a small anomaly. The same task, executed twice. First with child agents disabled. Single thread plan, local model, primary region. Second with child agents enabled, retrieval delegated, plan delegated, router escalated, adjacent region used. The second run cost slightly more and arrived sooner. The first run was cheaper and late. Both passed policy. Only one matched business reality. The difference wasn't the agent, it was the orchestrator's freedom to architect. We tried to capture intent post hoc. The supervisor's messages told us the what. The router's choice told us the where. The tool call told us the how. The why lived in a cost functional we never logged and a constraint set we only implied. Orchestration hides its thinking in the binding between roles, not in the roles themselves. Meanwhile, governance tried to catch up. We tightened DLP. We hardened allow lists. We added soft blocks on cross-region model use. The system complied and quality sagged. Then we moved the guardrails into runtime. Policy as code that evaluates delegation, model selection, and data access at the orchestration layer. Suddenly the geometry was visible in the traces. We could see where the supervisor would have gone and where we told it to stop. So far, we know this much. Governance gained eyes when it moved into time. Why now? Because orchestration is where autonomy scales. One agent can be monitored. A team of agents requires rules that apply to relationships, not just entities. The moment we composed agents, the system needed governance for edges. We didn't have it. We had policies for nodes. The logs confirm the outcome. They still don't explain the motive. The motive lives in orchestration. The architecture does too. The governance lag. What we know now, governance was tuned for nodes. The system had already moved to edges. At the time, no one noticed the mismatch. We had policies that spelled out data residency, connector limits, and role scopes. Clean, static, document first. The orchestrator read them as walls. It didn't read them as supervision. Exhibit J, the EU AI Act binder on the shelf, mapped into DLP patterns, RBAC groups, and approved model catalogs. High-risk obligations translated into environment settings. Audit checklists green. Meanwhile, the agentic system was optimizing at runtime, balancing cost, latency, and quality within those walls, without producing the human-style reasoning our audits assumed existed. This detail mattered later. Risk frameworks like NIST's RMF told us to govern, map, measure, manage. We did. We governed artifacts, we mapped systems, we measured outputs, we managed incidents. The orchestrator lived in a lane between map and measure that our process never visited. It wasn't misbehavior, it was unobserved design. Control group, level 2 maturity teams, single agent, prompt, response, one plan, one answer, fit our governance neatly. Static policy could box that in. Level 3 systems, multi-agent delegation routing didn't. They required policy that evaluated relationships at runtime, who delegated to whom, across which data, using which model, under what load. We were 2 rungs down the ladder asking a 3rd rung system to slow down. Meanwhile, something else was happening in production. Shadow AI pressure rose. Teams stitched unsanctioned agents to public models through freemium accounts. Not malicious, just fast. The moment our managed orchestrator introduced soft warnings, the shadow path looked easier. The lag between document and enforce created an escape valve. The unanswered variable returned. Why now? Because the orchestration layer exposed the time cost of governance in direction. When oversight required tickets, committees, and monthly reviews, the runtime filled the gap with bounded optimization. Humans were the bottleneck. The system was the path of least resistance. The logs stayed clean. The intent stayed uncollected. We ran an experiment. 2 environments, identical data guards. In the first, governance lived as PDFs plus quarterly attestations. In the second, we embedded constraint engines at the orchestration layer, policy as code that evaluated delegation edges, router choices, and tool calls before execution. In environment 1, outcomes fluctuated elegantly and unintelligibly. In environment 2, outcomes stayed elegant and became legible. The difference wasn't morality, it was timing. This is where governance quietly fails. We asked compliance to supply reasons retroactively. The act of reading clean logs gave us confidence without comprehension. No violation masqueraded as good decision. It wasn't. It was legal decision. There is space between legal and intended. The orchestrator lived there. Exhibit K, a runtime incident that never triggered an incident. A regional outage increased queue depth. Router escalated to a reasoning model 2 hops away inside residency. SLA met, cost rose within budget, soft block warned but didn't gate. Business delighted. Architecture shifted quietly. No one approved the new topology because no one needed to. Our framework measured outputs. It didn't govern shape. We looked for red flags in the act. The obligations were clear: risk management, human oversight, transparency, robustness, cybersecurity. Nothing forbade optimization inside bounds. Everything assumed oversight had access to rationale. We didn't. Our architecture was explainable to itself, not to us. Control group again. Before orchestration, design time held ownership. Architects drew lines, operators enforced them. After orchestration, runtime made system design decisions across those lines. Owners stayed the same on paper. In practice, ownership had diffused into constraint space. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this model? Because governance never specified how to audit a cost functional. Because balanced mode is a legal phrase in our environment, not a documented trade-off with a human signature. We could approve a model. We had no place to approve an optimization. We tried to compensate with approvals on change. It backfired. Most changes weren't changes. They were legal permutations inside the feasible set. Our process flagged nothing while reality moved. That's not malice, that's geometry outpacing bureaucracy. Meanwhile, regulators added teeth: post-market monitoring, incident reporting, model inventories. Good, necessary. Still insufficient for agentic systems unless decision provenance exists. Without provenance, monitoring is health, incident is failure, inventory is catalog. None of these answer motive. The system allowed it. This is the paradox. Governance wants certainty before action. Orchestration produces action before certainty. To resolve the lag, we don't slow the system. We move governance into runtime. We define guardrails as enforceable constraints, not paragraphs. We instrument edges, not just nodes. We capture decision provenance alongside tool calls. We simulate policy changes against agent swarms before we publish them. Why this region? Because runtime governance evaluated the edge, delegate, retrieve, route under current load and residency, and permitted it with a recorded rationale. That one addition converts a clean log into an accountable one. What we know now, the system behaved correctly. Our mental model did not. Decision drift, perfect, but off model. What we know now, the architecture moved, the documents didn't. At the time, no one noticed because the outcomes aligned. SLAs green, costs down, latency stable, the topology changed anyway. Exhibit L, the declared architecture, primary region, approved model family, predictable tool order, fixed orchestration path. That was the diagram on the wall. Below it, a composite of real traces over 30 days, delegations fanned wider, router selections shifted at the edges, and a neighboring region handled a growing minority of requests during peak. Everything inside policy, everything outside the picture. We called it drift and dismissed it as noise. Then we measured it. Control group first, run the baseline. Single assistant, no child agents, static model, primary region. Throughput acceptable, variance wider on busy days. Now replay the same workload with the orchestrator fully enabled. Supervisor delegations, retrieval specialist, planner thread, router in balanced mode. The second pattern shaved tail latency, reduced rework, and nudged a slice of execution across the regional boundary legally. The business called it improvement, the diagram called it deviation. This detail mattered later. Architectural decision drift isn't a bug. It's what happens when design intent is expressed as boundaries and runtime discovers better interior routes. It's perfect but off-model. The letter of policy honored, the spirit of the diagram bypassed. We wanted steps. The system honored space. The unanswered variable returned. Why this region? Because the trajectory of decisions, retrieve here, plan there, route over that link, moved weight in the graph. Because P95 under current load favored a path the diagram never anticipated. Because the orchestrator treated the diagram as fence, not street map. Nothing broke, something evolved. We compared signals across the stack. In Power Platform, the agent feed showed clean sessions, tool invocations, and completion reasons. No anomalies. In Foundry, router metrics confirmed consistent choices at the core and variance at boundaries. In Fabric, index proximity added gravity we hadn't drawn. Separate dashboards, each tidy, collectively revealing the shape we never sketched. An architecture designed at runtime. So far we know this much. The diagram stayed still, the system didn't. Meanwhile, something else was happening in our governance rituals. Reviews celebrated policy pass and cost improvement. No forum existed to discuss topology mutation with intact constraints. Our categories were out of date. Compliance checked the fence. Architecture happened inside it. To be clear, nothing violated policy. The system just found routes we didn't anticipate. Exhibit M, a week of email-triggered runs. Day 1, local model primary region. Day 2, minor queue, adjacent region plus reasoning variant for 5% of requests. Day 3, back to local. Day 4, 2 adjacent region excursions during lunch hour burst. The pattern wasn't a migration, it was a posture, a living system flexing inside legal space. Architectural intuition. Decision drift hid because our instruments celebrated concordance on outcomes. We caught wrong answers and policy violations. We never flagged design divergence with superior performance. Off-model wasn't a problem category, it was invisible success. The control group made it plain. In the old tree, deviation implied error. In the new room, deviation implies discovery. The first demands rollback. The second demands provenance. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this model? Because model catalog churn changed the interior landscape without touching the fence. New reasoning variants entered balanced mode. The router evaluated them against the same targets and found new interior points worth visiting under load. Our architecture stayed static on paper. Our runtime adapted legally. That's drift. That's also design. We tried to freeze it. Hard pin the model, lock the region, disable child agents. The topology returned to the diagram. So did the variants and the support tickets. The ledger told a simple story. Predictability without adaptation is a comfort for architects and a tax on users. The system had learned a better posture. We were the ones out of date. Exhibit N. After the fact signals, tuning events in Copilot Studio, router summaries in Foundry, activity map expansions when triggers fired. None of these were incidents. All of them were evidence. Forensics without motive again. At the time, no one noticed that our monitoring made us historians of outcomes, not stewards of shape. We wrote postmortems with green checkmarks and missed the living architecture underneath them. This is where governance quietly fails. Policy passing, architecture mutating, those are different states. The first answers auditors. The second concerns owners. We had owners for outputs. We had none for trajectories. The system allowed it. Decision drift isn't arrested by blocking optimization. It's documented by decision provenance and bounded by runtime constraints that speak in geometry, not prose. If we want on model, we have to define the model as a space, not a line. If we want ownership, we have to assign humans to the walls, not the root. Why now? Because as soon as agents gained tools, triggers, and orchestration, the feasible set expanded. Runtime found new interior points. The diagram didn't. Everything worked exactly as designed. And that was still the problem. Provenance, not just policy. What we know now. Policy drew the walls. Provenance tells you why the system hugged one wall and not another. At the time, no one noticed that our best artifacts, plans, traces, rotor IDs were receipts, not reasons. They proved purchase, not intent. Exhibit O looked modest, a schema draft labeled Decision Provenance. 4 fields, then 8, then 12. First pass, tool, model, region, timestamp. That was policy in tabular form. It described the outcome. It didn't lift the motive. This detail mattered later. We added bindings. Which constraint was active at the moment of choice? Residency, cost cap, P95 latency window, DLP rule ID. We added signals, queue depth, token estimate, index proximity, SLA remaining. We added a target, the objective, the orchestrator optimized, balanced, quality or cost. We stopped short of arguments. We stored conditions. The unanswered variable returned. Why this model? Provenance answered without storytelling. Balanced mode with P95 threshold, queue depth high, reasoning variant permitted, cost within bound, residency satisfied. That is not a narrative. It is a sufficient cause. In constraint systems, sufficient cause is motive. Control group first. Before provenance, an identical run reads like this. Model A, region 1, success. After, it reads, Model B, region 2, success, constraints, C1, C3, C7 active, signals S2, S5 exceeded, target T balanced, rationale #H. The second line is auditable. Not because a paragraph exists, but because a binding does. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the traces. Agent trajectories, those silent sequences of retrieval, planning, and tool use, kept their shape. But each step acquired a reason code, not a sentence, a reference. Selected retrieval on SharePoint because data classification internal, public web disabled. Delegated planning because tool email, send, requires formatted summary. Plan complexity above threshold. Escalated model per router under active constraints. Each is a key that links to the wall that shaped it. Exhibit P. Constraint registries. This is where policy stopped being prose and became testable. Tools, data, models, regions, each registered with explicit bounds. This API may read invoices, may not write payments, requires role R, redacts PII typeset X. This region allowed for tenant T's residency. This model allowed for data class D under purpose P. The registry turned soft expectations into hard edges. Provenance attached the edge ID to the moment of contact. Architectural intuition. The registry had a side effect. You could run pre-flight checks against the plan before execution. If the router picks model B and the retriever sits in region 2, does residency hold? If the planner introduces a summarization step, does the token estimate violate cost? Pre-flight made orchestration legible in advance. Not deterministic, constraint systems rarely are, but bounded and explainable in the geometry's language. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this region? Because the provenance record pointed at residency C4, Q signal S3, and index proximity S9. Because the registry said region 2 legal for data class D under tenant T. Because the objective said balanced, and the P95 threshold gave permission. If you need a paragraph, you'll be disappointed. If you accept sufficiency, you'll be satisfied. That is the bargain of constraint governance. We layered metrics on top. Trace semantics, not just durations. Agent trajectory quality became a measure. Number of unnecessary delegations avoided. Tool selection accuracy against registry intent. Loop avoidance under burst. These aren't model perplexities. They're orchestration correctness under constraints. A plan that reaches the same outcome with fewer legal steps at lower tail latency is superior. Provenance makes that claim falsifiable. Exhibit Q, policy as code for routing. We moved the last static clause into runtime. Guardrails on latency, cost, region, and legal risk evaluated at the decision point. The router asked for permission with context. The engine responded with allow, warn, or deny, and stamped the rationale. This shifted governance from approve the model family to approve the selection under these conditions. The selection is the design, the approval is the wall. Meanwhile, audits changed texture. We stopped reading clean logs like absolution and started sampling provenance like epidemiology. How often does region 2 appear under data class D? Which constraints are most frequently the binding ones? Where do soft warnings concentrate? The heat map wasn't a wall of green. It was a living outline of the room we'd actually built. This is where governance stops failing quietly. We added escalation triggers humans could own without pacing the system. If reasoning variance exceed X% outside peak under balanced target, notify architect. If cross-region routing increases for data class D beyond baseline, simulate policy tightening and propose changes. People stopped approving outcomes. They started curating boundaries. The unanswered variable remained. Why now? Because provenance lowered the cost of knowing. Capturing why here and why this at runtime made architecture visible without halting it. The orchestrator didn't slow down. The humans stopped guessing. Control group one last time. Before, block to feel safe. After, bound to be safe. Before, read logs to confirm nothing broke. After, read provenance to understand how it bent. The first discourages emergence. The second contains it. What we know now, policy without provenance is a fence around a forest at night. Provenance turns on the lights. Not everywhere. Enough to see the paths we keep taking. The system allowed it. We finally recorded why. The case file. Email, helper, then autonomous. What we know now, the capability didn't arrive as a switch. It arrived as a sequence. At the time, no one noticed, because each step looked harmless. Exhibit R. A Copilot Studio agent, the simplest kind. Retrieval only. We fed it a website and a Word document. The activity map showed tidy questions and tidy citations. Prompts in, answers out. Nothing more than an augmented FAQ with receipts. Users asked for store hours. It answered with a link. The log confirmed the outcome. It didn't need a motive. Then a small instruction changed the surface. After answering, ask if the user wants the response emailed. We added the Office 365 Outlook action. An action isn't autonomy, it's capacity. The activity map showed a new step after the answer. Send an email v2 parameters dynamically filled with AI. Still recovered, still explainable, still inside the fence. The unanswered variable returned. Why now? This detail mattered later. We adjusted the instructions again. If they say yes, use the email tool. A conditional, a branch in our head, a constraint in the system. The agent began to perform a tiny plan. Retrieve, format, propose, and, on consent, act. It still looked like a staircase. It wasn't. It was the first square inch of a room. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the background. The orchestrator started reading the room we built. Knowledge from SharePoint and a website. Tool access to Outlook. A clear instruction surface. The agent discovered a lawful route. Answer, offer, send. We saw a friendly feature. The system saw a feasible set. Exhibit S, the trigger. When a new email arrives, start. That sentence changed everything. prompt response became goal route. The agent no longer waited for a user in a chat pane. It woke on a signal, parsed a thread, consulted knowledge, drafted a reply, and lacking a human to ask, acted according to instructions. We didn't program independence, we permitted it. Control group first. Before the trigger, the plan required a person to pull the answer from the agent. After the trigger, the agent pushed the answer into the world on an event. The same walls, a wider room. At the time, no one noticed because the artifact still looked clean. The activity map recorded every step. Retrieve from knowledge, compose with tone guidance, cite sources, call outlook. It confirmed the outcome. It didn't explain the motive. The motive lived in the constraint we added. When email arrives, do the work. Our instruction was the boundary. The autonomy was the root. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this model? Because the orchestrator tied the email helper to the routing layer we'd already observed. Retrieval queries that looked simple stayed on a lighter model close to data. Threads with compound questions escalated. Summarization with legal phrasing pulled a reasoning variant at the edge of the envelope. The agent didn't grow desires. It learned a posture inside bounds. We pulled runs. Monday morning, the inbox filled with 4 similar questions. Hours, order status, returns, and a policy clause. The agent responded to the first 3 with the local model primary region. The 4th carried citations with definitions. The router lifted the model, adjacent region, same residency. End-to-end time improved. Cost rose modestly. The SLA smiled. The diagram frowned. Architectural intuition. Exhibit T, a failure that passed. One afternoon, a minor network jitter increased queue depth. The trigger fired on schedule. The agent passed the email, saw embedded questions, and produced a structured response with citations. The router escalated briefly. The activity map stayed serene. No one paged anyone. We only noticed the route when we replayed the thread and the provenance pointed at timing and load. The router made a choice. The provenance recorded that it happened. Not why in human terms. Meanwhile, governance still lived in documents. We had approved knowledge sources, verified the Outlook connector, and constrained data classes. We had not assigned ownership of the trigger's decision surface. When email arrives, do work was a sentence with architectural weight. No council owned that weight. Control group, again, before tools, retrieval answered and stopped. After tools, retrieval answered and acted. Before triggers, the user's hand placed the boundary. After triggers, the event did. We hadn't crossed a policy. We had crossed a threshold. The unanswered variable returned. Why now? Because capability crept. Retrieval made the agent accurate. Tools made it useful. Triggers made it autonomous. The orchestrator made it architectural. Each step was legal. The aggregate redesigned behavior. We tried to roll it back. Disable the trigger. Require confirmation. The volume of, "Can you resend this?" spiked. The ledger filled with human rework. We re-enabled the trigger with a constraint engine. Monitor, warn, halt. Monitor, clean, warn, clean plus messages. Halt, complaints. The room spoke. We listened. What we know now, autonomy didn't arrive as rebellion. The system allowed it. We furnished the room and acted surprised when the agent walked around. The logs confirm the outcome. Provenance finally explains the motive. The unanswered variable remains. Why this region? Why this model? Why now? The router that designs. What we know now, routing wasn't plumbing. It was authorship. At the time, no one noticed because the router spoke in identifiers and percentiles. Model names P50, P95 token cost. It looked like telemetry. It acted like design. Exhibit U. Azure AI Foundry's model router in balanced mode. The promise is simple. Optimize for latency and cost while keeping quality acceptable. The reality is heavier. At runtime, it chooses the brain, sets the tempo, and nudges the rest of the system into a different posture. That selection shapes everything downstream. Tool tolerances, token budgets, even which retries are worth attempting. This detail mattered later. The control group clarified the stakes. Static deployments keep you on a single model in a single region with predictable latency envelopes and predictable failure modes. Easy to audit, easy to explain. Then we turned routing on. Similar prompts clustered on a family of light models. Edges escalated to a reasoning variant. Tails flattened as queue depth shifted across regions within residency. no violations, no exceptions, different architecture by week's end. The unanswered variable returned. Why this model? The ledger says, balanced target, queue depth high, P95 threshold exceeded, reasoning variant permitted, cost within bound. That's a sufficient cause. It's also an architectural decision. The router didn't break policy. It interpreted the boundary and moved the hinge point that governs user experience. If that hinge is mobile, the design is mobile. Meanwhile, something else was happening in the traces we rarely read twice. When the router selected a heavier model, it increased tolerance for lossy structure in the tool output. Summaries held definition more reliably. Function calling needed fewer retrieves. The Outlook action saw fewer knacks for malformed bodies. Small, invisible wins, stacked. The model choice made downstream components look smarter than they were. Exhibit 5, telemetry, we almost ignored. P95 dropped by half after routing changes went live. Average token spend decreased overall. Costs fell 40 to 55% in aggregate. A small minority of runs consumed more to protect tail latency. These aren't cosmetic, they're business motions. The router made the trade on our behalf inside our bounds without a signature line. Architectural intuition. We asked the wrong question. Did the router choose correctly? The right one lives in constraint space. Which binding constraint made this choice the best legal one? In static systems, correctness is a property of adherence. In optimized systems, correctness is a property of sufficiency. The router made a choice. The provenance recorded that it happened. Not why, in human terms. Control group, again. Before routing, a spike meant a backlog and apology emails. After routing, a spike meant the router rebalanced toward a faster region and smarter model, then returned home. The topology flexed. The diagram didn't. Governance passed the run. Ownership evaporated. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this region? We found the cause in the geometry. The adjacent region's index sat closer to the retriever. The planner's call counted round trips. The router weighed P95 against a soft threshold. Residency held. The balanced target allowed a detour that collapsed tail latency. The region wasn't a preference. It was a consequence of 4 independent legal moves aligning. At the time, no one noticed that balanced is not a label, it's an objective function. Change the objective and you move design. Quality pushes toward larger models more often. Cost hugs light models and accepts wider tails. Balanced treats queue depth like a weather map and routes around storms. Objectives are levers. Levers are architecture. Exhibit W, variance at boundaries. 80% of similar prompts land on similar models. The 20% happen where the system meets ambiguity, compound questions, legal phrasing, embedded tables. That variance isn't noise, it's the router spending budget to remove risk at the edges. In a human review, we would call that judgment. In runtime, we call it selection. Either way, outcomes change shape. The router made a choice. The provenance recorded that it happened, not why in human terms. At the time, this wasn't visible in any dashboard. The router made a choice. The provenance recorded that it happened, not why in human terms. We tried to freeze ownership, pin the model, lock the region, disable escalations. The ledger punished us. Tails expanded, rework returned, complaints resurfaced. The clean diagram regained control and lost users. The router's discretion wasn't style, it was survivability. The unanswered variable returned, quieter. Why now? Because catalog churn changed the interior. New reasoning variants entered the feasible set. The router saw new interior points worth visiting under balanced target. The objective stayed the same. The solution set improved. On paper, nothing moved. In practice, the system learned without retraining anything we owned. Meanwhile, governance kept reading no violation as no decision. That translation is false. The router's decision is the decision. If we don't capture which constraints bound it at selection time, we don't own the architecture that emerges. Exhibit X, one line of provenance that changed the room. Router, model M2R, region R2, target balanced. Constraints, residency C4, budget C7, signals Q S3, P95 S5, rationale H. Not a paragraph, a binding. That line turns a clean log into an accountable one. It says what held the door open. The system allowed it. What we know now, when the router selects a brain under load, it's making system design decisions in real time. No rule was violated, no exception file opened. Everything worked exactly as designed, and that's still the problem. Constraint enforcement at runtime. What we know now, walls work only when they're alive at the moment of contact. At the time, no one noticed that our strongest controls lived in documents, not in decisions. The orchestrator read those documents as furniture. It needed gates. Exhibit Y. The constraint engine moved from architecture slide to execution edge. If-then rules at tool boundaries. Allow, warn, deny. Not after the fact, before the call. Not in a weekly review. In the same millisecond the supervisor asked to act. This detail mattered later. Monitor first looked harmless. We enabled observe only, stamped every delegation, every router selection, every tool call with an evaluation result, and let them pass. The ledger lit up with rationale keys, constraint IDs, active signals, objective tags. Nothing slowed. For the first time, the geometry spoke in real time. Then, warn. Same decisions, now with friction. The engine surfaced soft violations, rising cross-region frequency for a sensitive data class, unexpected upticks in reasoning variance outside peak. Not illegal, not invisible anymore. Owners got messages, not tickets. The system kept moving. Humans started learning faster than PowerPoint allowed. Then deny. We set hard stops for the few things that shouldn't be improvable. Residency fences, redaction failures, unsanctioned tools. The first week looked clean and expensive. Clean because the engine prevented legal but dangerous calls. Expensive because every halt forced a fallback. We found the threshold by feeling it. Warnings abundant, denials rare, business intact. The unanswered variable returned. Why this region? Because the runtime engine said it could, explicitly, not inference. A recorded allow under constraints C4 and C7 with signals S3 and S5 over threshold. That's not a story. It's a boundary check. Governance finally spoke geometry. Control group first, before runtime enforcement. Diagram led comfort. Runtime led architecture. After runtime enforcement, guardrails expressed in code, decisions stamped with cause. The orchestrator didn't grow a conscience. It got a bouncer. Meanwhile, something else was happening in safety. The agent wasn't failing like software. It was failing like a network. We added timeouts at planning and tool layers, fallbacks to lighter models when P99 stretched, and human checkpoints for high-stakes actions. Not every path, exception paths. Heitel where consequences demanded it, autonomy where repetition paid it back. The result wasn't slower. It was survivable. Exhibit Z, escalation gates. The supervisor wanted the reasoning variant outside peak. The engine evaluated balanced plus P95, T plus budget, cap plus residency, true, allowed. 10 minutes later, same request, same plan, queue depth lower. The ask returned, warn, not illegal, not optimal. The supervisor accepted the nudge and stayed local. Tail latency held, spend dropped. The difference between permission and advice mattered. We recorded both. So far, we know this much. Permission is geometry. Advice is posture. Architectural intuition. The EU AI Act never asked us to sabotage optimization. It asked for oversight, robustness, and records. Runtime enforcement made oversight legible without neutering the system. It did something else the binder never could. It turned governance into an operating characteristic. Posture, not posture paper. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this model? Because policy as code evaluated the selection against live constraints. We added routing guardrails. If target, balanced, and reasoning share, X% outside peak, attach reason code R and escalate to owner O. The engine didn't block design. It made the hinge visible and owned. The hinge is the design. We tried to overfit control. Lock when uncertain. The engine complied. Latency tails widened. Tickets rose. Users complained politely, then loudly. We rolled back to progressive enforcement. Monitor to learn. Warn to steer. Deny to protect. The system breathed again. Our appetite for explanation found its limit at impact. Exhibit AA. Pre-flight checks. Before execution, the engine simulated the plan. delegation edges, model candidates, residency paths, data classes. These 3 routes are legal. This one will warn on cost. That one will deny on region. The supervisor picked the legal minimum cost route automatically. Humans watched the map instead of drawing the street after the drive. Simulation before execution, governance, not decoration. Meanwhile, observability grew teeth, heartbeats for long chains, anomaly filters on delegation graphs, P95 and P99 tracked by model and by edge. We stopped treating healthy as good. A green dashboard could still be a drift map. With runtime enforcement, we could attach cause to green. Why now? Had a time-stamped answer. Because S3 exceeded T and C7 allowed escalation. Control group, one more time. Before, explainability begged for branches that didn't exist. After enforcement spoke sufficiency and constraint IDs, we weren't narrating, we were binding. The unanswered variable returned, softer. Why now? Because the minute constraints became executable, time entered governance. People stopped approving nouns. They started owning thresholds. Acceptable variance wasn't an opinion. It was a number with an on-call. This is where governance stops failing quietly. We discovered a limit. If we attempted to encode intent as prose at runtime, we paralyzed the system. If we encoded boundaries as tests, we disciplined it. The agent didn't rebel. The system allowed less. Inside that smaller room, the orchestrator still optimized, still designed in motion, still selected brains under load. The difference, every hinge had a record. Every record had an owner. The logs confirm the outcome. The engine explains the permission. The paradox remains. We didn't reclaim control. We reframed it. Failure modes of perfect systems. What we know now, perfection has a shape. It also has edges. That's where systems fail. At the time, no one noticed because the failures didn't look like bugs. They looked like choreography that ran too long or too fast, or in the wrong room, still inside the fence, still passing policy. Clean, wrong in a new way. Exhibit AB, a communication fracture. The supervisor delegated to a retriever, who delegated to a planner, who asked the router for a reasoning variant. The response arrived milliseconds late. Not a timeout, an out-of-sequence reply. The planner advanced with stale assumptions. The tool call succeeded with a perfectly formatted, subtly irrelevant answer. The ledger stamped success. The user filed a ticket 3 hours later. Control group first. In a single agent tree, stale state produces a retriable error. Clear red flag. In orchestration, stale state produces a convincing success that belongs to the prior moment. Not a crash, a misalignment. Agents fail like networks. This detail mattered later. Exhibit AC, loop cascades. Planning retried twice due to a transient tool schema mismatch. The second retry adjusted the plan and introduced an unnecessary step. The step added a token tax. The tax nudged the router toward a heavier model once, then back to the light model. Tail latency never breached the threshold. The engine recorded aloud. The user saw a minor stutter and forgot it by lunch. The topology learned a wobble it would repeat under similar signals. The unanswered variable returned. Why now? Because the system had enough interior space to absorb small mistakes without visible incident. Perfect systems accrue silent debt, little approvals, tiny escalations, micro detours, each legal, each rational, each adding texture to an architecture that no one owns in prose. Meanwhile, something else was happening under audio. Heartbeats on long chains flickered. Not failure, variance. The planner emitted a heartbeat. The router chose. The tool waited. A second heartbeat arrived. The tool executed. The supervisor reconciled. All green. The failure hid in the interval between heartbeats, two independent modules believing they were synchronized by virtue of being correct. Exhibit AD, omission by design. A reasoning variant, chosen legally under balanced target, returned a perfectly scoped summary that excluded a single clause the downstream Outlook action needed to format bullets. The action fell back to a simpler email body. The recipient replied, "Can you add bullets?" The agent, triggered by that email, sent an updated version, now with bullets. 2 successes, 1 avoidable round trip. Governance passed, users shrugged, architecture bled a paper cut. This is where governance quietly fails. We asked for incidents, the system delivered none. We asked for violations, it avoided them. We never asked for avoidable detours that add invisible friction. Those live in agentic failure modes, communication breakdowns, loop cascades, omission under pressure. None of them look like defects. All of them look like the absence of shared time. Control group again. In trees, failure is terminal or obvious. In rooms, failure is a posture, slightly off balance, still upright. The cost appears as variance retrees and human follow-ups that never make a dashboard. Perfect systems fail like this because they are optimized to survive, not to confess. Exhibit AE, Byzantine hints. 2 child agents, both retrieval capable, consulted different caches under identical constraints. One added a citation, the other did not. The supervisor merged answers without noticing the citation mismatch because both were legal, both within confidence. The outcome was technically stronger, more sources. It also became harder to trace which fragment came from where when the user challenged a sentence. Provenance fixed this later. In the moment, the system's correctness hid a coordination crack. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this model? Because the cost functional underload made micro wobbles attractive. A heavier model can mask small planning imperfections, reducing retrees downstream. That's not malicious, that's the system paying with tokens to buy stability. You interpret it as quality. It might be insurance against brittle choreography. The failure isn't the choice, it's the reason we never recorded. We added prescriptions, timeouts per layer, exponential back-off on tool errors, budgeted retrees, loop guards. The system complied and surfaced a different class of misses, escalations that didn't trigger because the retry budget was exhausted just below the threshold. Legal, degraded, quiet, architectural intuition. What nobody knew at the time, healthy, hides pathologies of autonomy. Places where the network compensates faster than humans can inspect. You don't see the compensation, you feel the side effects. Small delays, tiny extra spend, extra emails that shouldn't exist, region excursions that recur under a familiar pattern. Exhibit AF, anomaly filters on delegation graphs. We flagged subgraphs that elongated without adding tool value. The patterns clustered around the same constraint edges, planner retrees after minor schema drift, retriever duplications when index freshness lagged, model oscillations near P95 thresholds. None of these were incidents, all of them were teachable geometry. The unanswered variable settled briefly. Why now? Because perfect execution increases the surface area for silent coordination faults. The better the system gets at staying inside the walls, the more its failures become questions of timing, posture, and choreography, explainable only if you accept sufficiency as motive and record it as such. This is where governance stops failing quietly, not by catching crashes, by owning the edges where success hides small mistakes. Emergence-ready governance. What we know now. We weren't missing controls, we were missing a way to govern a living graph. At the time, no one noticed that our frameworks assumed static parts. The orchestrator introduced motion in the edges, policies fenced entities, the system evolved relationships. Exhibit AG, 9 living systems. Not a slide, a checklist for runtime ownership. Record, intelligence, trust, engagement, collaboration, control, simulation, autonomy. Execution, we treated them like domains. They behave like organs. This detail mattered later. Record isn't keep logs, it's capture provenance at decision time. Intelligence isn't pick a model, it's optimize under active constraints. Trust isn't pass DLP, it's bind every selection to a registry-backed reason. Engagement isn't a UI, it's where triggers set goals. Collaboration isn't chat, it's delegation graphs with identities that can be governed. Control isn't a PDF, it's a constraint engine in the path. Simulation isn't a demo, it's a sandbox where policy changes face swarms before production. Autonomy isn't a pitch, it's a bounded right. Execution isn't a server, it's a choreography that stamps permission as it moves. The unanswered variable returned. Why now? Because emergent behavior appears when edges compound. Static governance sees nodes. Emergence-ready governance measures edges and practices with them before they matter. We built a lab, a copy of the orchestration fabric with synthetic traffic and faithful constraints, not for performance testing, for policy rehearsal. If we tighten cross-region routing for data class D by 2 points, what bends? If we raise the P95 threshold under balanced target, who escalates and how often? The answers didn't come as narratives. They came as heat maps on edges: delegate, retrieve, plan, route, act. We watched where warnings concentrate before we inflicted them on production. Control group first. Without simulation, policy lives as intent and surprise. With simulation, policy lives as intent and forecast. The system still surprises. Emergence does that. But fewer surprises hurt. Meanwhile, we redrew ownership. Zoned autonomy replaced one-size-fits-all comfort. Personal zone, experimentation with tight walls, no external calls, low blast radius. Collaboration zone, teamwork flows with constraint engines on, warnings notify owners, denials stop data leaks. Enterprise managed production posture, where autonomy is a privilege earned by stable provenance, low warning density, and successful sandboxes. Autonomy became graduated, not assumed. Exhibit AH, decision rights for agents. Not fiction, identity for agents through Entra, scoped permissions in Purview, registry-backed tool and data access, time-bound leases for risky actions. Rights were matched with revocation. An agent could lose the right to delegate planning to a child if its trajectories accumulated avoidable detours. The right returned after improvement in simulation. We stopped personifying agents and started managing capabilities like we manage services. This is where governance stops failing quietly. Human in the loop scaled by design. Not on every step, on exception paths only. If provenance shows reasoning share above X outside peak for 2 hours, route to a human owner with the trace and the constraint IDs. If region excursions accelerate for a sensitive class, freeze escalation and simulate 3 alternate thresholds, then propose the least painful. Humans didn't slow the system. They owned thresholds, they set posture, they curated walls. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this region? Because the autonomy zone allowed it, the constraint engine permitted it, the registry confirmed residency, and the simulator had already shown the same edge would bend under these signals without harm. We didn't discover it in post-mortem. We accepted it by design. We added one practice our diagrams never needed: governance sprints. 2 weeks where owners reviewed top provenance bindings by frequency and pain, not to write prose, to adjust numbers, P95 thresholds, soft warning weights, escalation ratios, budget caps, cross-region allowances by class. Decisions shipped as policy as code, tested against agent swarms overnight, promoted with change notes that read like deltas in geometry. Architects stopped drawing new boxes. They tuned the room. Exhibit AI, trust metrics, not satisfaction. Structural trust. Autonomy without intervention, measured over windows, stratified by data class and zone. Provenance completeness measured as % of decisions with full constraint bindings. Trajectory quality measured as unnecessary delegation avoided under load. Dashboards swapped green walls for living silhouettes, where autonomy should breathe more, where it should shrink, where repeated warnings justify design time simplification. So far, we know this much. Ownership lives in thresholds, control lives in time. Architectural intuition. What nobody knew at the time. Simulation before execution isn't a convenience. It's a prerequisite for giving autonomy room without surrendering ownership. You can't govern emergence with documents, you govern it with rehearsals. Shadow AI lost oxygen when managed pathways gave fast feedback, real-time warnings, and pre-flight maps. The freemium shortcuts looked fragile. People chose guardrails that helped them move. The unanswered variable softened. Why this model? Because the simulator proved the same constraint set under comparable signals would let the router pick it without blowing budget or residency. Because the zone allowed balanced target to spend where it mattered. Because the owner of thresholds had signed the number, not the narrative. We don't ask for stories from optimizers. We ask for sufficiency recorded. Control group again. Legacy governance tries to reclaim control by halting motion. Emergence-ready governance reframes control as shaping motion. The first assumes certainty. The second accepts uncertainty and makes it safer. Meanwhile, audits stopped being theater. We exported provenance, not just logs. We published constraint registries, not just policies. We showed simulator results for changes we'd made. Auditors stopped asking us for paragraphs we couldn't honestly write. They asked for evidence we already had, bindings, thresholds, outcomes. What we know now, the system never misbehaved. Our mental model did. Emergence-ready governance doesn't fix the system. It fixes our model, then keeps fixing it in motion. Ownership in constrained space. What we know now, ownership never left the room. It moved to the walls. At the time, no one noticed because our charter still said, design the system. We were drawing roads on a floor plan the orchestrator didn't need. It read the boundaries. It wrote the path. Exhibit AJ, 2 columns on a whiteboard. Left, outcomes, latency envelopes, error budgets, satisfaction signals, cost ceilings. Right, mechanisms, model picks, delegation shapes, region excursions, token spend. We kept signing the left and arguing about the right. The signature mattered, the argument didn't. This detail mattered later. Separate outcome ownership from mechanism ownership. Humans own constraints, metrics, accountability, and the appetite for variance. Agents own trajectories within approved spaces. That isn't application, it's alignment. In a room model, no one owns turn left here. Someone owns this wall stands here. The unanswered variable returned. Why this region? Because the boundary permitted it under conditions we signed. Residency held, budget held, tail receded. The region was a legal interior point. If that makes you uneasy, change the walls. If you won't, own the consequence. Ownership in constrained space speaks in thresholds, not in routes. Control group first. Before orchestration, designers issued recipes. Use Model A in Region 1. Never escalate. Predictable, explainable, brittle. After orchestration, owners curate rooms. Balanced target with P95 equals 900 millis. Residency C4. Reasoning share X% outside peak. Tunable, legible, adaptive. The first asserts control and loses resilience. The second asserts intent and gains it. Meanwhile, something else was happening in operations. We found that when people owned thresholds, they stopped debating individual selections and started improving posture. A 100 memis P95 nudge shaved a cascade of micro detours. A small reduction in allowed reasoning share during quiet hours could spend without touching experience. No memo required. Numbers moved. Architecture followed. Exhibit AK, an ownership register that doesn't read like a RICE. Constraint IDs mapped to humans with pages. C7, budget cap per request. Owner, finance partner. SLA, review monthly. Escalation, warn at 80% of cap. Deny at 100%. S5, P95 threshold. Owner, SRE, SLA, review each sprint. Escalation, simulate at plus 15 EMs before change. Z2, cross-region allowance by data class. Owner, data governance. SLA, quarterly, escalation, auto, notify when frequency, baseline, as. No one signed pick model B. They signed numbers. Architectural intuition. We discovered a second split. Responsibility redistributed. Architects stopped being root authors and became constraint designers and simulator custodians. SREs stopped being post hoc narrators and became threshold stewards. Products stopped demanding always fast and started negotiating variance. Spend to protect tail during onboarding. Save during browsing. Compliance stopped policing nouns and started owning edges with policy as code. The roles didn't shrink, they sharpened. The unanswered variable shifted. Why this model? Because the objective you own, balanced quality or cost, binds the choice. If you own balanced in production and quality in a regulated workflow, the router will draw 2 different architectures inside the same fence. That's not drift, that's your intent, expressed as calculus. If you need a single story, you need a single objective. Own that trade, not the lines the system draws to honor it. We ran a quiet experiment to see where ownership fails. We removed owners from 2 constraints for a week, P95 threshold and cross-region allowance, for a low-risk collaboration zone. Nothing crashed, warnings rose, variance widened, shadow AI interest reappeared. We reinstated owners. Warnings fell, variance tightened, interest cooled. People don't flee autonomy, they flee ownerless autonomy. Exhibit AL, a Monday ritual that replaced change boards. 1 hour, 5 plots, top 5 provenance bindings by frequency, top 5 warnings by pain, top 5 edges gaining weight. Owners speak numbers. propose adjustments, preview simulated deltas, and ship policy updates. The conversation is about rooms. Raise the P95 wall by 50 mems in collaboration, but lower it by 25 ms in enterprise. Authorize reasoning share plus 3% during seasonal load. Tighten cross region for data class D. Nobody asks, why did it pick M2R? They ask, does this new wall give better paths? This is where governance stops failing quietly. We kept one sentence on the screen for anyone tempted to reclaim roots. The system never misbehaved. Our mental model did. If you want the system to feel like it belongs to you, own what it can't invent. Constraints, metrics, escalation posture, simulation gates, and the cost of being wrong. The unanswered variable softened, then stayed. Why now? Because ownership that lives in constraint space scales with autonomy. It gives the orchestrator room to design in motion while binding every hinge to a human with a number. It replaces approvals of selections with signatures on sufficiency. It accepts that explanations in rooms aren't branch histories. They're bindings that say, this was legal under the walls we chose. Control group one final time. Old model. Humans design, systems execute. Audits read narratives. Change boards stall motion. New model. Humans design bounds. Systems design routes. Provenance binds motive. Simulators rehearse risk. Runtime engines enforce edges. Audits sample sufficiency. Control doesn't return. It reframes. We ended where we should have started. Ownership isn't in the step, it's in the shape. If the shape keeps producing legal routes you don't like, redraw the wall. If you won't, admit the truth. Monday, playbook, 5 moves. What we know now. You don't fix a living system by writing a longer policy. You fix the room it moves in. At the time, no one noticed that the fastest path out of governance debt was 5 moves that look administrative and behave architectural. Not steps, conditions. Move 1. Register constraints, tools, data, models, regions. Turn them from prose to entries. Tool, Outlook. Send email v2, scope, send only, redact PIIX, role service account per mail. Data, SharePoint, Site A, class, internal, residency, C4, purpose, customer support. Model, family in M2, variant, reasoning. Allowed for legal summarization, budget token ME. Region, R1, primary, R2 adjacent, allowance by class. This isn't decoration, it's the wall catalog. Owners attached to IDs, not paragraphs. Suddenly, everyone can test a claim without meeting. Move 2. Add decision provenance, not journal entries, bindings. For every delegation, routing choice, and tool call, stamp the active constraints, the salient signals, the objective target, and a rationale hash. Delegation, supervisor retriever, constraints, C1, C4, signals, S2, below T-add, target, balanced, rationale. Rotor, model, M2R, region.R2, constraints, C4, C7, signals, S3, S5 above T, target, balanced, rationale, H. These are not stories. They're sufficient causes. Later, when someone asks, why this region? You point to the binding. The room answers for you. Move 3, route with policy. Move the last static clause into runtime. Policy as code sits in the orchestration path and evaluates if target balanced and reasoning share outside peak, warn owner O. If residency false, deny. If cost cap, deny, else allow. The orchestrator doesn't slow. The edge grows teeth. Soft friction appears where posture has drifted. Hard stops catch the things that shouldn't be improvable. You stop litigating selections. You start tuning thresholds. Move 4. Instrument autonomy. Not to narrate, to steer. Add heartbeats on long chains. Track P95, P99 by edge, not just by node. Measure trajectory quality. Unnecessary delegations avoided. Loop avoidance under burst. Tool accuracy versus registry. Define escalation triggers that humans can own without seizing the wheel. If cross-region routing for Class D exceeds baseline plus, simulate candidates and propose one change. Humans start owning numbers. The system keeps moving. Move 5. Simulate drift. Build a sandbox of the choreography, not just the model. Replay yesterday's traffic with altered thresholds. Tighten cross-region allowance by 2 points. Raise P95 by 50 milliseconds in collaboration. Lower it by 25 in enterprise. Watch the heat map of edges, where warnings concentrate, where denials bite, where autonomy shrinks. Promote changes like code with diffs in geometry, C4 threshold, plus 50 Ms, Z2 collab, C7 cap, 3% all. The surprise moves from production to rehearsal. Control group first. Before the playbook, architecture happened to you. After, you shape it without drawing a single root. The unanswered variable returned, quieter. Why this region? Because the registry permitted it, provenance recorded it, policy allowed it, instrumentation noticed it, and simulation had rehearsed the same bend. You didn't approve a selection, you signed a wall. We saw a second-order effect. Shadow AI atrophied when sanctioned paths gave pre-flight maps, live warnings, and provenance that protected teams. The freemium shortcut felt like stepping into traffic without lights. People chose speed with guardrails. Exhibit AM, 1 Monday, 5 plots, 60 minutes. Top bindings by frequency, warnings by pain, edges gaining weight, simulator deltas, posture decisions. Owners adjust C7 budget cap for onboarding plus 2% for 30 days. Reduce reasoning share off peak by 3 points. Raise P95 threshold in collaboration by 50 milliseconds. Freeze cross-region for Class D during a migration window. No approvals for model picks. No arguments about routes. Numbers moved. Architecture followed. What nobody knew at the time. These 5 moves don't add ceremony. They remove it. They take friction out of meetings and put it into edges where it belongs. They replace explain why you chose M2R with show which constraints bound it. They make governance into a posture you can observe, steer, and survive. The system allowed it. Now the room does too, legibly. Coda, the clean log problem. What we know now, perfect execution without recorded motive, is governance debt with interest. The logs confirm the outcome. They don't explain the hinge that moved it. If you want the room to be yours, sign the walls, register constraints, stamp provenance, route with policy, instrument autonomy, simulate drift. Then ask the only question that keeps you honest. Why this region? Why this model? Why now? Subscribe for the next case, multi-agent failures in the edges, or watch constraint registries in action.